in around 1900, America was in a predicament very like the one we're in now. Very high inequality, very high political polarization, very high social isolation, and very high, I would say, self-centeredness. Americans in that period, the culture was very much an I culture, not a we culture. And then in a short period of time, roughly speaking, from 1900 to 1920, roughly, we turned it around. I don't mean America became and we certainly did not overnight become a marvelous place. And we never became an idealist place. Above all, we ignored then and now issues of, now we're doing a little bit better about that, issues of race. But we changed the direction of the society from going downtown. Every decade, every day, it seemed, we were becoming more polarized, more unequal, more self-centered, more socially isolated. And then we changed the direction, which is what we want to do now. We want to become more towards like a we society, a little bit more of a we society. You can have too much of a we society, but well, not where we are now. We're not exclusively an I society. They turned it around. What lessons can we learn from that period? And here's the single most important lesson that my co-author on that book, who you also know well, Shailene Romney Garrett, when we looked at what was the thing that turned first then that might give us a clue as to what we ought to do now, I was shocked to discover it was culture, and not just culture, it was morality, by which I'm not talking about sexual morality, I'm talking about the simple golden rule. America in the 1880s, let's say, among other things, very unequal, very polarized, etc., but also, and deeply, it was a society in which the culture, the intellectual culture, was what was called social Darwinism. Darwin didn't believe this, but a lot of people said, well, if red in tooth and claw is the way society progresses, animals progress, we ought to focus on us, me is the way to go. But then, and this is the crucial point here, I know you know this, but maybe our audience doesn't know it. What happened then was what was called the social gospel. And it was initially a religious movement. And I'm not deeply religious, and it was an evangelical Protestant movement, and I'm for sure not an evangelical Protestant, but I can look as a historian and say, those people said, the social gospel people said, look at the they didn't say damn, look at the darn Sermon on the Mount. It's not about glorifying rich people. He says, harder for a rich person to get into heaven than a camel to get through an eye of a needle. Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount was saying, worry about the least of them. And so that social gospel was, in the first instance, all it did was to change the attention of some evangelical Protestants toward focusing on the society and not just their own salvation. But it spread very rapidly to all.
Well, this was the period of the birth of settlement houses and the period of the birth of all these associations.
So now the question that I'm now suggesting, and I know you know the answer, well, if that's where we have to begin, I'm not saying that the other symptoms are not worth worrying about. Inequality, we got to worry about that. Polarization, we got to worry about. But what was upstream of all that the last time we fixed it was a sense that we're all in this together and we all have a stake in everybody's success. Very simple moral principle. And therefore, why don't you talk about the work you've done in that dimension?
Well,
I'm thinking about civic Saturdays and so on.
Absolutely. By the way, the book you just referred to there that you and Shailene Romney Garrett co-authored is this book called The Upswing. And The Upswing, How America Came Together a Century Ago and How We Can Do It Again. And you were speaking exactly about that period that began with the social gospel movement in the progressive era and led to this, well, not even renaissance, this birth of an ecosystem that was far more inclusive than certainly the colonial United States had seen. Or the Reconstruction era United States had seen of that kind of associational life, and that in that period you describe this pendulum swing from an I-oriented society more toward a we-oriented society, and then of course Bowling Alone captures the way in which the pendulum swung back toward I in much of our lifetimes, but I think the invocation of the social gospel movement is relevant because one of the programs we have at Citizen University. And I should back up to say that, again, your teachings are studded throughout all of our work. And one of them is this simple idea that culture precedes structure, that that before you get to policy change, structural reform, that attending to a culture, if a culture is hyper-individualistic, self-centered, materialistic, nihilistic, memoryless, obsessed with rights to the exclusion of responsibility, then your room to change structure in any direction is extremely narrow, right? And so how do we shift culture? And one program that we have at Citizen University in that vein, as you allude to, is called Civic Saturdays. And Civic Saturdays are gatherings that are essentially a civic analog to a faith gathering. It's not church or synagogue or mosque, but on purpose, it has the flow and the arc and the feel of that kind of gathering in which strangers are invited to enter a space, meet one another, talk about common questions that are way past small talk. Questions like, who have you failed lately? What is broken in your heart right now? What's broken in your neighborhood or your community? Where we rise and we sing together, where there are texts that are shared that you can think of as civic scripture, where someone will deliver a civic sermon to try to make some sense of these times in this moment. And then people will form into civic circles afterwards to say, okay, we've been shifted and moved a little bit here. We've been invited to kind of open up that aperture. Now, what are we going to do? How are we going to look differently at the crisis of whatever it might be, homelessness, displacement, deindustrialization, urban-rural divides, opioid crisis, various things that are hitting all of our towns, to use the title of another one of your books, right?